All right, it is a couple minutes after noon, so I think we should go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monica Driggers. I'm the Deputy Director for the Massachusetts Rivers Alliance. Welcome to the Dam Busters 101 series. This is a collaboration between Mass Rivers, the Charles River Watershed Association, and the Massachusetts Division of Ecological Restoration. This is an educational series offering basic information about dam removals to managers for municipalities and nonprofits that may be considering such projects in the future. Please note that the series is not intended to advocate for the removal of any specific dam or dams. Before we move on to today's presentation, I have the following announcements about the future of the series, which should help you think about what you might be doing next year. This is the last Dam Busters webinar for this year, but please stay tuned as our team is in the process of working out next year's series. Once we have it all worked out, we'll broadcast an announcement to everyone who registered, so you will get a sense of what you can participate in next year. Um, Secondly, as most of you probably know, we're holding an in-person dam removal site visit in Braintree on September 18th. It's a lunchtime program. Right now, the program is full and there is a wait list. However, we are hoping to hold a second site visit tour in October, but we haven't finalized those arrangements. Please stay tuned. We will send out the information as soon as we have it. And lastly, for those of you who have been wondering about what we are going to be presenting next year, we project that next year's series will start in January and February, and it will likely add to topics that we covered this year, plus offer some more in-depth programming and the more direct um, Q&A with experts that a lot of people have been asking for. This is why your survey responses are so important, because that's where we're getting the information to develop next year's series. So please respond to the survey that you will receive after this webinar. So back to today's session, which is on permitting. A few housekeeping items. Note that the webinar is being recorded. Recordings and any other webinar materials will be made available on the Mass Rivers website after the session. If you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A feature, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Our staff are monitoring that feature, or you can hold your questions until the last half hour's Q&A session. Third, we ask that you put your name and your affiliation in the chat, please. That helps us out. And lastly, once again, please complete the evaluation that we'll send you after today's session. Again, it's really offering us good information on what to put in next year's webinars. So now I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Neil Price of the Horsley Witten Group. Neil has over 30 years of professional experience in the fields of hydrology and hydrogeology. Neil is responsible for developing client relations, supervising staff activities, and managing various water resources related projects. The nature and extent of the work he conducts includes river, wetlands, lake, and salt marsh restoration, dam removals, culvert replacements, watershed and drinking water protection studies, drinking water and irrigation supply, groundwater and surface water modeling, wastewater disposal, coastal geology, nutrient management, stormwater management, as well as development review and permitting. So you are in great hands with Neil today, and I'm delighted to have him start his presentation.
Thank you, Monica. Hold on, I have a little bit of a screen mishap here on my end. One second, I have, what are folks seeing? Because I've lost view of the group here. All I have is the slideshow showing up on my screen right now.
Right now, we're just seeing you, Neil. So I think sharing the slideshow is
okay.
glitch.
So there we go. All right, so let me pull this over and do share screen.
No worries. Multiple screens and Zoom often don't mix. I'm sure everybody feels your pain here.
Okay, how are we doing now? We have an opening slide. It says dam removal permitting in Massachusetts.
So what we have is the slide with, we're not in full slide view, but we can see the presentation slides on the left. And then the full first slide.
Let me
on the
try
right.
again. Share.
There we go.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Sorry for the delays there. So thank you, Monica. Thank you, Anna. Thank you for everyone at Mass Rivers Alliance and the Dam Busters for doing this. It's such a fantastic thing you're doing to bring all these people together. And I love seeing all this interest in this important topic, you know, with 3,000 some odd dams in Massachusetts, the vast majority of which not serving any more functional purpose. It's great to see the momentum building for this practice and all the people interested in it and the momentum that it's receiving. So today I am going to talk about the permitting process specifically for dam removals. It's a bit of a dry topic. I'm going to do my best to keep it interesting, and I'm going to keep it at a fairly high level. There's a lot of details to be gotten into, and I understand that there's be the opportunity for more presentations on this next year during Dam Busters that will make into some details on specific permits and so forth. We'll try to keep this at a fairly high level, and I'm really excited to have had Alex do the sediment management presentation last month. Hopefully most of the folks here heard that. Did a great job of talking about what's frequently one of the biggest issues with dam removal and one of the biggest issues with the permitting. So I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on that, which will save me some time into the other aspects of the permitting. So we'll give a little context, some overview. One of the main things you'll hear a lot about is, are you going to pursue the ecological restoration notice of intent track, or what I'm calling the standard notice of intent track, which is how permitting happened before this ecological restoration avenue was introduced to the regs of Massachusetts, originally about a decade ago, but really in the last couple of years, having been changed to provide a lot of benefits to it. So it's becoming more popular. And kind of lastly on this slide, that I know there are others on this call, regulatory agency folks who will know more than I do about some of these specific permits. So when we get to the question and answer period, please feel free to raise your hand if you're, you know, a regulator or someone that has some valuable input to any questions we might get, to either correct mistakes they may have made along the way or answer specific questions. I'm also going to kind of highlight two different projects that we at Horsey Witten have worked on at a couple of points through this show. One being the Case Parker Conservation Area on Sucker Brook and Pepperell, the other being the Ipswich Mills Dam in downtown Ipswich. And the reason these two projects are being highlighted is they're kind of polar opposites from each other. Case Parker, I believe, someone from DR might correct me, has set the record for the fastest dam removal from concept to actually being completed within about 2 years in Massachusetts to date. Ipswich has been ongoing for over a dozen years, and anyone who follows the news has seen that there's a lot of controversy about that. We have a lot of great momentum for that now, and it looks really good moving forward. But just to show you that what your dam is, what's around it, and where the project matters for how smoothly this process will go. I think most importantly, Case Parker, as you can kind of tell from the pictures, is out in the middle of the woods in a conservation area with no one living around it. The dam is small. Ipswich is right in the heart of downtown Ipswich. It's been an integral part of the history of Ipswich and its industrial history for close to 400 years. People have a really close attachment to it. It has sensitive infrastructure all around it. So all of the complications there that are not present at Case Parker created the two different ways that those projects have transgressed through the years here. So I kind of, whenever I think about permitting and kind of the difficulties of it, I think back, and those of you of my vintage will remember the whole Schoolhouse Rock series and sitting in front of the TV on Saturday mornings watching cartoons and learning about the world through the educational stuff. But the I'm Just a Bill slog and the poor Bill trying to find his way through Capitol Hill and eventually become a law. But it's a little bit what this permitting process is like. So I want folks to remember that permitting of dam removals is complex. Requirements will vary by the project. I've already told you about how Ipswich and Case Parker worked out so differently. You need to worry about, are you tidal or inland? You need to, unfortunately, there are regional agency differences. Everything in life comes down to individuals, right? So different individuals in different regions of regulatory agencies will view projects differently and permit them differently. There are local regs town to town that can change how things go. Do you have a federal lead agency or not? That dictates some of the permitting you have to do. Are you in mapped rare species habitat? Are you in a mapped DFW Division of Marine Fisheries Fishway? Are you in a cold water fishery? Are you in an outstanding resource water and ACEC? All those things will dictate the complexity of your permitting and some of the boxes you have to check on the forms. Contamination history is the big part of the sediment. Again, I'm not going to talk a lot about that because Alex handled it really well, but it is important. We should all remember that this takes some time. Typically, just the permitting review times are something from 9 to 18 months, depending on what the project is, and several months, 3 to 6 months of actually getting these permits or longer submitted. So you need some patience. You need to consult early with all the various agencies involved to get their input to smooth the process. And as Alec mentioned last week with sediment, it's probably in your best interest if you are at a watershed association or you are in a municipality to enlist some professional help, which isn't to say that you couldn't do this on your own, but it will be a challenge if you've never done something like this before, and probably better to have some professional help with you. A couple of big picture things here. There's you heard Alex talking, and I agreed last week about how we kind of have a need for a more streamlined permitting approach in this state to ecological restoration in general and dam removals. We've kind of reached the point, to me and to many of the thinking of people on this call, I'm sure, that these are good projects. We kind of understand how they're going to play out. And I think there's a roadmap forward to have a more streamlined approach. But that's not now. The now is we have a permitting process that is a little bit cumbersome, and the regulations that we're all falling into were not crafted with ecological restoration in mind. Let's remember that this type of work was not very popular until the last 15 to 20 years. The regulations are dating back to the 1970s, some of them, and we're mostly about development, building stuff. Like, are you a housing development or a commercial development or bridges or something of that like. So that's how the regulations were crafted. And regulators have to evaluate all these projects fairly. So just because folks know, well, dam removal has all these benefits, it doesn't mean, we have to understand that regulators have to still evaluate every project per the regulations, per its impacts. So these two pictures on the left are interesting to that regard. It's two of our projects. And if you looked at them, at these two pictures, you would say, well, the lower one in the water is the most ecologically disruptive. You've got an excavator in the water, creating a bunch of silt and so forth. But that one is a dam removal project. The upper one is a housing development project. So folks in this call might say, well, the dam removal project has all of these good benefits long term, and that's true. But in the short term, you have to understand that they do have impacts. So it's fair to understand that regulators, so don't be upset with regulators looking at this project, at your dam removal project strictly. It's part of their job and it's important. So have patience, lots of patience. Here is just a list of what are the common potential permitting requirements that you will need to go through for a dam removal. Not every dam removal will need all of them, and there are even some that might need more than these. these, but this is a list, and it's a whole host of acronyms. I'll list out a few here. So MEPA is the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act. There are two tiers to that: environmental notification form and environmental impact report. Dam removals, we'll get into this in a little bit. Dam removals almost always fall into the mandatory EIR, because any reduction in impoundment capacity, and by definition, if you remove a dam, you're going to change the impoundment capacity, is a mandatory EIR. So this is one of the benefits of the newer approach to the ecological restoration notice of intent, is it allows you a streamlined path through MEPA that doesn't include going this standard route. So and because of the need for the mandatory EIR, it saves you that. It's a really important newer benefit. Mass DEP has two regulatory permit requirements: a Chapter 91 permit or a license. This is about waterfront access and navigability. The 401 water quality certification is about sediment quality. You heard all about this last week from Alex. The Army Corps of Engineers has their 404 permit, which is closely linked to this 401 permit. They're both coming out of the Clean Waters Act. Both have to do with sediment quality, but they're two different permitting processes and requirements, one state and one federal. The Army Corps also has Section 10, which is Rivers and Harbors Act, that applies to tidal waters in a couple of the larger select rivers in Massachusetts. You always will need an order of conditions obtained via a notice of intent through your local conservation commission and Mass DEP, because by definition, all dam removals are occurring in wetland resource areas. If you have natural heritage and endangered species mapped habitat, you will need to coordinate with them and make sure that they are okay with the project and that there is not a take of rare species, and that gets incorporated into the notice of intent process. You have to talk with Mass Historical Commission, and if you have federal funding, there's a federal historical component. The Office of Dam Safety will always need to be involved, because if it is a regulatory dam, because the removal of that dam would require a dam safety permit. You likely will need a Division of Marine Fisheries fishway permit if you are in a mapped fishway. You might need Mass Wildlife consultation for non-marine fishery issues. If you're in the CZM coastal zone, you will need consistency review from them. And if you are impacting downstream flooding, you might need FEMA review through a letter of map revision. NEPA, of course, comes in for federal stuff, and NIPDs would be filed by the contractor. This is a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System for essentially stormwater management if you're disturbing more than an acre, which you frequently would be. So before you get into doing any of this actual permitting, you want to do some GIS review for typical constraints. One of those, as I mentioned, is natural heritage. So do you have mapped estimated or priority habitats? Here's an example. Where my map opened up, this is Barnstable Harbor, showing some of the mapped habitat there. If you do have mapped habitat in your project area, you need to first file a request to Natural Heritage to find out what those species are. And then you need to consult with them and file what's called the Habitat Management Project Review Request to see how your project may impact those rare species. And before you can move into getting a notice of intent, you must receive an official determination from NISA that you will not be taking that rare species. So that can either be just that the project will not have no effect, or they may condition the project such that you will avoid any effects. So this is really important if you have that mapped habitat there. Also, you want to check out if you are within a mile of an environmental justice community. This is another one of the newer changes to the regs in the last couple of years that comes into play through MEPA. And this is another reason why the ability to have the ecological restoration notice of intent shortcut through MEPA is important. Now, as I mentioned, all dam removals, if they went the standard MEPA process, would be a mandatory EIR. the EJ thing also kicks you into a mandatory EIR. So you're not getting out of that part, either way you look at it. But what is important is, depending on what your EJ community is mapped at, whether it be language and so forth, if you take the standard MIPA track, you will potentially have translation and all sorts of language requirements and so forth. So if you're looking for your shortest path through the process, avoiding MIPA by doing the ecological restoration notice of intent would allow you to avoid all of this. So this is why you just need to know what you're up against before you get too far into the process. So while you're doing all this GIS review, you also want to look into a bunch of other stuff. Are you a jurisdictional dam? So these are dams of various hazard classes shown here in Mashpee in this case. You can also look up through various technical reports if you are a DMF fish run, or if there's a time of year restriction that will come into play in the permitting. Are you in the CSAM coastal zone, as I mentioned, and all mapped other things that come into play here. Then, after you're done with the GIS, this work that I'm talking about here will generally occur in what the stage of a project we would call the feasibility study, the removal feasibility study. So you would do all that GIS assessment, and then you would do some preliminary modeling. So in these images on the left here, we're showing existing, this is Ipswich, existing and proposed conditions of the velocities in the impoundment and what would be suitable for sediment migration or not. So you need to know, so this volume, in this case, the yellow would be the post-dam removal sediment migration area. And you need to calculate that volume of sediment for your permitting, and you need to calculate your areas of impact. So here's a couple of numbers. It's not all that important. If you want to keep in mind, 5,000 square feet is an important impact for cumulative wetlands impacts and wetlands loss for how you get dealt with in both the water quality cert and through MIPA. But as I mentioned, if you do the ecological restoration notice of intent track, you can avoid that part of it. And then you need to know that mobile sediment counts as dredge. So in almost all cases, that's going to be more than 100 cubic yards. So that's going to tip you into needing the 401 water quality cert dredge permit. And if you have more than 5,000 cubic yards, you're a major dredge permit. You also need to look at what the flooding impacts are going to be. So this again is Ipswich, and we're showing in red and blue the existing versus proposed 100-year flood change. And it's important to know that you really want to avoid, it's almost essential to avoid increasing flood risk to existing structures downstream. You also need to evaluate what your changes in wetland types are going to be. So where is land underwater going to turn into BVW? You need to look at fish passage. Are your post-dam removal conditions going to remain suitable for fish passage in terms of both depth and flow? Will there be scour impacts to bridges or other infrastructure? Will paddling still be able to occur? Will the drawdown of the impoundment affect nearby wells? You can't have water supply impacts. That has to be evaluated. So once you've done all of that pre-work, now you're going to start into your permitting. Your first major question is, will my dam removal qualify as an ecological restoration project? As I've been talking, you have your choice of these two tracks. Are you going to go the standard? Or are you going to go the ecological restoration route? In almost all cases, you're better off faster. There are benefits of going the ecological restoration route. We'll talk a little bit about this, you may still choose to go the standard, but you need to make sure if you're going to do that you can qualify. So dam removal is one of the 6 pre-qualified eco restoration NOI types, but you have to remember that your dam cannot be used for flood control, can't be a hydropower dam. So in other words, it can't be a dam that still has a real function to be qualified for this. And as I mentioned, your project cannot impact public or private water supplies. So this could be both direct reservoir withdrawals, or it could be impacts on nearby wells. So you have to make sure that that's all true. And the last thing is that you need to remove the full vertical extent of the dam, and you need to remove enough of the horizontal extent that you're not going to be impounding the 500-year flood behind it in order to technically qualify as an eco restoration NOI for dam removal. Remember that this is all because notices of intent are evaluated at the local level. Your local conservation commission is making these decisions. And again, as I said, everyone is different. You get different opinions from different towns about these details, but these are the key things you need to be keeping in mind. So the benefits of going to the Eco NOI, and most importantly, simplified MEPA process. So it's instead of doing a whole ENF and then an EIR, which can take a year and cost many thousands of dollars, it's a fairly simple form, the map and so forth. It's just a notice to MEPA that you're doing this. It's essentially MEPA is acknowledging that these restoration projects are beneficial, and they're allowing them to shortcut the process as a result. This, many of us would argue that many of these other permits should follow suit, but again, that's not where we're at right now. Depending on which one of these you pick, there is a different order of operations. The Eco NOI hits the notice of intent last in the process or later in the process, whereas the standard NOI typically gets it first. Your agency input gets taken up front with mandatory meetings ahead of time and written feedback from the agencies to be included with the notice of intent, whereas in the standard process, the agencies would just comment on each of the individual permits. One thing I want to mention is you can, and this happened in Ipswich, where the town just opted, it was an eligible Eco NOI, the town opted to do it the standard route in order to be fully upfront, allow everyone to have as much public input as possible. So it is an option. You can decide to go the standard route if you want to be as transparent as possible to folks. Running a little short on time here, so I'm gonna go through this, but this is sort of the order of operations. I won't read them all. You can read from top to bottom of how the standard NOI track would go for permitting. And this is the last that I'm going to talk about, the standard track, because I do think that in most cases, the Eco NOI is the preferable track that most people will take for dam removals. And then this is the track for the Eco Restoration NOI. Again, it's most important. You have these mandatory pre-permitting meetings up front. You got to gather all their input before you go into things. And again, most importantly, all you have is this notice of ecological restoration to MEPA to satisfy your MEPA requirements here. Another important question is how much dredge. As I mentioned, 100 cubic yards is the trigger for requiring a water quality cert. You're almost always going to do that. Here's a cross section of another project in Southeast Mass, where essentially we're looking into the river from downstream to upstream. Here's the dam, and in orange is the extent of mobile sediment that we use to calculate the volume that might be gone. So this is essentially the fine sediment where the velocities post dam removal will be fast enough to move that fine sediment downstream. You need to know if you're going to have federal funding, and this is not essential to have up front, but if you're going to have federal funding and a lead federal partner, then you're going to get kicked into this additional extra historic permitting. And we're not going to talk any more about this. If there are questions later, I think there are probably people on this call from NOAA or other federal agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, that could answer some of the details. But generally, those federal agencies would be responsible for leading this, what's called the Section 106 Natural Historic Act component of this stuff. And it gets done in conjunction with the Army Corps 404 permitting. Talked about how the MEPA is this notice of ecological restoration, and you also have, if you're in an EJ community, it's worth noting, this is fairly simple too, but you do have to still provide advance notice to a list of community-based organizations if you are within 1 mile of an EJ community. The water quality cert, Alex talked about this last month. Very important first step, you don't want to skip this, is that meeting with DEP. You have to have done a due diligence study of potential contamination sources and put together a sampling plan that DEP will approve before you can conduct your sampling. And then, once you've conducted your sampling, have the results, you submit your application. This permit requires public notice in the local newspaper. Army Corps builds off of that 401. Applies to any dredge or fill in the water of the United States. Section 10 applies only to tidal waters and select large tributaries. This is an interesting side point. So in my career, this definition of waters of the US has changed about 4 times with various Supreme Court decisions. Depending if you have a Republican or a Democrat in charge and the leanings of the Supreme Court. Most recently changed about a year or so ago to become fewer water resources were waters of the US as we currently stand it with the current conservative Supreme Court. And because I just always like to look at the bright side of things. So I actually had one project, it was a cranberry bog restoration project that would have been subject to 404 permitting. Due to the new Supreme Court decision about what's a WOTUS or not, that cranberry bog fell out of definition of a waters of the US, and we no longer needed Army Corps 404 permitting. So a little bright side of a otherwise poor decision, in my opinion. The 404 can generally be applied for under the Mass General Permit number 10 as a pre-construction notification form. Army Corps will not approve your 404 permit until the 401 water quality cert is also approved at the state level. You have to notify as part of this process the Mass Historical Commission, the Bureau of Underwater Archaeological Resources, and the various recognized tribes on the list. You have to send them notice of this as part of this process as well. Then you finally get to the actual Eco-NOI submittal after all of this. So you've got to have all that other stuff in hand. Most importantly, the actual approval for the 401 needs to be in hand before you can advance into submitting your ecological notice of intent. You also have to have your agency approvals to support it. So depending on what your constraints are that you have to have letters from those various agencies to include that. And again, you have to public notice in the Environmental Monitor, the newspaper, and send certified mailings to abutters. Chapter 91 remains applicable under both standard and the Eco-NOI tract. You have to have your Eco-NOI submitted first. You will likely need a permit in most cases for the removal of the dam structure. There have been cases where non-tidal dam removals have been deemed exempt. They don't reduce the navigation area. If that dam was an unauthorized dam, many of these older dams do not have any Chapter 91 authorization currently. So depending on what region of the state you're in and who the people you're dealing with, there is a possibility to avoid Chapter 91 permitting at all. But again, this is the value of having these pre-permitting discussions. Frequently you do need at least a permit, and frequently you will need a license. So the movement part of a lot of dam removals is moving debris around and grading the channel. Chapter 91 will frequently view that as something requiring a license. Again, something I don't personally agree with, but that's the current way the process works. More public notice needed. Other approvals, I've kind of talked about a few of these. The FEMA Clomar Lomer. The Clomar comes first, the Lomer comes second. I'm not going to talk much about this. This is really only needed if you're going to increase flood levels downstream, which you should almost mandatorily have to avoid. It's optional. Municipality may want to apply for that just to change the mapping. So you can frequently, a dam removal will lower flood levels upstream of the dam, and there may be a desire to change the mapping, get updated insurance receipts as a result of that. But that's sort of an accessory thing here. Lastly, there is the opportunity for emergency removal approval, which I'm calling it your monopoly get out of jail free card. This is rare. There are people on the call here who can talk about this if folks have questions, but you don't. It allows you to essentially skip all of this permitting, fast, cheap, and efficient, but it is very rare. The only times it gets allowed, it has to be an imminent safety risk. The dam has to be in real risk of failure and causing real harm. And its removal or repair has to have been ordered by an agency like the Office of Dam Safety. And maybe not also importantly, it only authorizes the bare minimum amount of work required to reduce the risk. So you don't necessarily get to do the full ecological benefit dam removal here. You just have to knock it down enough to make it not a hazard anymore. And after you've gone through all of that and received your permits, your bill is now a law. Don't forget that you do have to actually register both the notice of intent and the Chapter 91 at the Registry of Deeds before you can then move on to construction phase of the project. And we'll open it up to questions and comments now.
Thanks so much, Neil. Like, it's such a complicated topic, and to zoom out to 30,000 feet and try to distill it into slides is really difficult. So I'm sure everybody very much appreciates your excellent slides and the fact that you broke it down step by step. We don't have a lot of questions yet, but there is one in the chat. Why is NEPA so late on the standard track?
I have just listed it late there. I guess in most cases that I've been involved with, the NEPA only comes into play if you have federal funding and a lead federal partner. And the projects I've been involved with, that is not necessarily all set up in process at the time you're doing the permitting. So you may not have all of, like, ideally a project would have all of the millions of dollars in need to go all the way through to construction before you even start. That's rare. So projects frequently go into the permitting phase with just a limited amount of money available that may not include any federal partners yet. So you don't know that you're going to need that until you get into the point where you have big dollar federal funding behind you that's going to make that NEPA a priority. If you do know that, you can certainly start earlier.
Okay. And I guess on that, sort of in that same vein, how long, I know we talked about 9 to 18 months generally as a time frame for permitting. How does the federal permitting process add to that, or can it be incorporated within that general standard of 9 to 18 months?
I think in general it can be incorporated within that.
Okay.
Again, assuming that like when you know that you're going to need it, you need to do it. If you know that early enough in the process that you can do it at the same time.
Okay. And then I guess the next question that I have is, if let's say that you're a municipality or, a watershed group looking at dam removal, and you've successfully started in on the process and you start working with a group like Horsley Witten, this is such a complicated process. In general, would you say that, watershed groups or municipalities or whoever is, managing the process, how big a group of people are they working with when they work with the permitting process? Because it seems to me, as somebody who's a newbie, who doesn't know very much about this, that you might be working with the contractor themselves or the consultant themselves, and then also a number of subcontractors or other experts in the field.
So to do the permitting, is that the question?
Like, how to do the permitting? Yeah.
Yeah. So I will say that generally it's the same consultant that you have hired or want to hire for the feasibility study and or the design of the project would lead that. And depending on who that consultant is, they might, sub out the permitting to a whole other group that does permitting nothing but, or they might have if they're a big company, that might have a permitting group within themselves that does it. Here at Horsley Witten, it's, we're reasonably small. It's kind of just us. So the same people that are doing the design are doing the permitting. You have to interact with your clients for their input on this. So that could be the watershed organizations or the municipalities in general. One of those two would be the most common clients doing it. We have, in trickier cases, we do sometimes talk with likely contractors who would be doing the actual work to get some feedback on how they might approach them to figure out. So there can be times where how you want to get to the project area and work zones might change your impact assessment. So like, how many different places do you need to come in from to do all the work that needs to get done? So you might want to talk to a contractor ahead of time to figure that out so that you can accurately figure out your impact areas for the permitting. And this is kind of critical, right? Is that you want to generally be conservative in your estimate of impact areas so that you're permitting a project that is the maximum disturbance that will actually happen. Because you can always do less disturbance, but you can't come back after the permitting into final design and the contractor says, there's no way we can get our equipment in this access place that you have put on design plans. We need, 5 times as much area, and now you've got way more disturbance than you permitted, and that's a problem.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question from Duncan. Does the New England District of Army Corps typically issue individual permits for dam removal projects in Massachusetts?
So there might be someone from the Corps here, so I will certainly defer to them if they are. I want to jump in, but in my experience, it is mostly general permits. I have not worked on an individual permit, and I'll worked in a bunch that have been to the general permit.
Okay. I think that might be the end of the questions that have been submitted so far. We have a slightly smaller group than usual.
There are some questions in the Q&A feature as well.
Okay. Those are not coming up for me. Do you wanna?
Yeah, absolutely. The first one is from Sarah, and she says, Neil, great presentation. Did you go through the JD process with USACE on the application of updated WOTUS definition on your bog project?
No, I just had a conversation with them.
Okay. Thank you. If you have additional question on that one, Sarah, just feel free to add.
Yeah, feel free. My email, if you didn't write it down, I will.
Yeah, I can drop your email in the chat in a minute and we'll. Great. The next question is from Joshua, and he says, does the 100 cubic yard 401 WQC threshold only apply to manually remove sediment, or does it also include the volume of estimated sediment that will move naturally once the dam is removed?
It is the latter, unfortunately, and that's why I say that almost all dam removals will require it, because it's hard to imagine. There would be very few dam removals that won't have over 100 yards of passably movable sediment that would move behind the dam afterwards.
Thank you. Great. The next question is from Anders, and they said, did I understand you to say that upstream sediment that is anticipated to wash downstream during / after dam removal naturally counts towards the 100 CYD dredge limit?
Yes, that's true. Same question, same answer.
And then the last question we have right now is from Heather, and she says, what triggers the federal agency that leads the Section 106? Whether you are receiving federal funding from them and at a specific type of funding, for example, design, permitting, or construction. If you are not receiving federal funding, is it just the Army Corps that leads 106?
So if you don't have federal funding and you don't have a federal lead agency, there is no 106. You just do your standard Army Corps 404 permitting that includes notification to the Mass Historical Commission plus the tribes and the underwater archaeology, but there is no 106 process required. It is the significant federal funding, significant enough. I don't know, and there again, there might be people on this call to answer this better. I don't know what the dollars amount are that's significant, but at some point, if there is significant enough federal dollars, there's always what's called a lead federal agency. So they become a partner on the project. with whoever the municipality is, and they would then be the ones that trigger and do the actual 106 permit.
Great, thank you. Okay, Monica, that was all the answers that were in the Q&A. I don't know if there are any more in the chat.
Yeah, I don't see any further questions in the chat. I'll give people a couple of minutes if they have further questions. I did put Neil's email address in the chat. So thank you, Neil, for being available for follow-up questions, because permitting is so complicated. I'm sure folks will think of things probably after this session. I do want to take a little bit of time as we start to wrap up here to thank everybody for participating in Dam Busters and making it such a great success this year. When we started this out, we hoped we might get 100 people to join us from across the state. Oh, there is actually one more question. I'll finish this and I'll ask that question. We now have around 530 people registered for Dam Busters. I was telling Neil before we started that we have people coming in from the UK and from Canada. So it clearly, there's a real demand for this information, and we are delighted at Mass Rivers, DER, and Charles River Watershed to be able to provide the information to everybody. And we really hope to expand it, particularly on a complicated topic like permitting next year. So on that, I will ask this question from April. How do you typically evaluate if a project impacts public-private water supply?
That's a great question, April, and something I intended to talk about more, but I was running behind what I thought was my time limit, but we were a little faster on the question and answers than I thought. So we'll spend a little bit of time on this. So if you have a reservoir, so if there's a surface water withdrawal in your impoundment, that is generally gonna eliminate you from being able to do your dam removal. But I guess it's possible, I guess, that there are some circumstances where the intake for that reservoir is low enough and what the impoundment characteristics might be that you can still do it. But I would say in general, if you have that, you're not going to have a dam removal project. You don't want to be removing dams in an active surface water reservoir. So then what I think you're asking about mostly is the groundwater wells that are nearby. So it's a multi-step process. So first you need to do research of where there may or may not be wells. So the public wells are easy enough. That's all in MassGIS. And if your client is the town, they will have all that data for you of where the wells are located. So you map them, you see how far away they are. Private wells generally are the ones that get a little trickier. So you need to figure out where, in those situations, you need to figure out where there is town water supply distribution, then talk to the Board of Health and see what their records are like. And town by town, that varies about the quality of the data that the Board of Health records. Some towns have really great records that have accurate GIS point data of all their private wells. You can just plot them on a map and see where they are. Others, you don't have that. In the situation where you don't, what I normally do is look at the mapping of the public water supply distribution system versus developed parcels, and assume that any parcel that is developed and is not on the public water supply distribution system must have a private well. So then you look where those are related to your impoundment and drawdown. And for private wells, the thing to remember here is as water level in the impoundment drops, it will affect groundwater levels adjacent to it. However, that effect gets fairly quickly muted as you move away. So we're probably talking about, by the time you get like a half a mile away, especially for private wells, you're probably not going to have a concern. For bigger public wells, you might want to be working out to more like a mile to look at them, just because they're withdrawing so much more water. Then also, while you're doing your records review, you kind of want to know how deep those wells are. Where is that screen located? Is it right at the surface of the water table, or is there some room below it? So then once you know where all of these things are in 3 dimensions, then you need to look at how water level in the impoundment will change. And this this is going to get awfully technical for the folks that don't have hydrogeology background. But when you evaluate, let's forget we're talking about dam removals at all. If you were just talking about drawdown impacts from a pumping well on something else, right? There's standard hydrogeology math formulas that you can use to predict how much drawdown will occur at X distance away from a pumping well pumping at X gallons a minute in given geologies. So what you do in this case is you imagine the impoundment water level drawdown to be an imaginary pumping well in the center of the river causing that drawdown. And then you run those same math calculations to figure out how far away the cone of depression will extend and how much drawdown will occur at different distances, and then compare that to where your wells of concern are. So are you getting 3 feet of drawdown at a given private well or only 6 inches? And that math uses as inputs, you need to know things like how thick is the aquifer, what is its hydraulic conductivity. Also things that are really hard to get a handle on. You can estimate them. That actually, this is a great opportunity to say this. Folks out at UMass Amherst have within the last year just added to MassGIS a bunch of really cool data layers, including hydraulic conductivity, specific yield, and maybe something else too about depth to groundwater. You can get that info off of Mass. It's not going to be perfect, but it's at least an approximation you can use to run these calcs. So that's a lot. Likewise, if you want to talk more about that, feel free to email me or ask a follow-up now, because we do have a little bit of time still, I think.
Wow, that was a great overview of a really complicated scientific process. We do actually have one more question in the Q&A. This was about, I think, really about streamlining. Do you work in other states with more efficient and faster permitting processes, or do you know of other states' processes?
I know a little. The vast majority of the work I've done personally has been in Massachusetts. I know that there are, I've heard from others that there are other states out of the New England region that are much faster. I think New Hampshire has a more streamlined process. I have been working in Rhode Island a little bit where that process is worse. No offense to our Rhode Island regulators that may or may not be here, but this discussion that I sort of hinted at about how important it was to figure out your change in wetland resource types. So are you going from land underwater to BVW and so forth? In Massachusetts, that's acceptable. The regulatory agencies in Massachusetts understand the benefits of dam removal and understand that changing land underwater to BVW is a necessary byproduct of that, and accept that as an okay thing to do. And it is. I mean, BVW has lots of great, maybe you could argue that it has more benefits for various reasons. However, in Rhode Island, they don't look at it that way. Any change in wetland resource type is considered negative. So we're in the process of doing one now. I don't know if others on this call have succeeded in doing dam removals in Rhode Island, but we're working through this now to get a dam removal permitted and figure out how to get around this requirement that you're not able to change land underwater to BVW without mitigating it.
Great, thank you. We do have people from the chat weighing in on Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania perhaps being a little less onerous. And I know there are groups in the state working on streamlining permitting, and they're looking at models from other states. So that certainly is a topic that's being worked on, and seems to have a lot of fans out there among professionals and regulators, etc. So hopefully progress will happen soon. So with that, I think we're pretty much at time. Neil, I want to thank you on behalf of our group and everyone participating for a really excellent presentation, and also again for your willingness to answer questions as they come in from folks as they think about this more. And again, and this, by the way, this session was recorded and it'll be, you can go to the Mass Rivers website if you want to go through the recording, because I know it was complicated information that people might want to review again. And the last thing I will say is thanks again to everybody who has participated in Dam Busters this year. We hope we've helped you out, and we hope we continue to help you out in the coming year. And you can always send any comments or ideas for topics you want to cover in the future to me, Monica Driggers at massriversalliance.org or via our website. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great afternoon.